Welcome back to Real Talk with Susan Stone and Kristina Supler. We are full-time moms and attorneys bringing our student defense legal practice to life with real, candid conversations.
Today's topic is the changing landscape with regard to standardized testing. We're here with Davida Amkraut, who works with students on all aspects of the college application process. And for our listeners, you probably recognize Davida. She's been a guest before on Real Talk with Susan and Kristina. Davida, we're so pleased to have you back today.
And you know what, Davida, since you've moved, it's really fun seeing you on screen. We've really missed having you. So welcome back to our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here.
And a lot of changes with regard to the SAT and ACT. Can you get our listeners up to date? What are the hot issues and changes and just helpful tips that our listeners need to know for would it be rising juniors that really should pay attention, or rising seniors, or both?
I would say both. And I'd say that since the pandemic, there has been huge shifts in the college admission process, largely because a huge population of the students were unable to test safely for their application season, which led to many schools going test optional for the years following the pandemic. And that trend, some thought was going to be temporary, and that as soon as that it was safe enough to test centers would open and colleges would revert back to their testing policies and things would just continue as normal. What we're seeing in the college admission world is that, in fact, many schools are keeping that test optional policy.
Let me interrupt you. I apologize. But just for our listeners who are just new to the college journey with their children, explain what it means for being test optional.
Good question.
Okay, so there are actually two different terms that our American applicants should know. The first one is test optional, which means that the student has the option to have their test scores considered. That means that they are able to include them in their application if they want to, and they're also able to say, no, this test score is not reflective of my academic potential, and I don't want schools to have access to my scores. That's one option. There is also what we call the test blind or test free, which is also taking off, which means that students don't have any option to submit scores. They are not going to be reviewed. And the University of California system and the Cal State system have now extended their test blind policy for a few more years.
But you know what, Davida? I just have to talk to you about this because it appears, I just read an article to prepare for this podcast, that the UC system has done a study, and they actually think that they might consider going back to tests because they're finding that the overall caliber of students is lower and that the SATs are a good predictor of success. Have you read that study?
Well, there are a bunch of schools that are saying that, yes, this test is a predictor. MIT is one of those schools that actually has gone back to requiring test scores. They are saying that that helps them really understand the readiness of their students. I think it really depends on who you're talking to. I think the real reason the UC system and the Cal State system went test blind is because of the equity issue. Because a lot of their population, there's a huge discrepancy between who can afford test prep and who can't, and the accessibility is not there for a lot of their population. So that is one reason why that is such a big movement in the California area.
But is it going to stay that way? I mean, am I accurate in what I read about the UC system and the data that's come out of this decision? Have you read that?
Yeah, they've committed, though. They have committed to the next year or 2 years to being test blind. So they are not switching over anytime soon in the next couple of cycles.
And with test optional, is it fair to say that for those schools that are test optional, that only students who get the 35 or 36, or is the SAT still at a 1600, are going to submit their scores? Because so it's sort of ridiculous. You're only going to see top scores?
I mean, I would think an average score on the SAT or ACT, those students aren't going to submit it, right? I mean, tell us what you see in your experience.
So what most families do and what most schools suggest and what most counselors suggest is that you go on the tool called a common data set, which is something that colleges put out. They're required to put this out. And you go and you look at the average SAT of kids that were accepted to that said university or the average ACT. And they will give you the average. And then you look, if your scores fall within that average, you should submit your scores. If they fall below the average, then that's your cue not to submit scores.
But then isn't that a flag to the admissions officers? The student who submits the score, it's probably below our average range.
Oh, yeah. They'll say that's below the average rate, or it could also be that they couldn't test, or there were other extenuating circumstances, or that a student has test anxiety and they just aren't
someone really having an open mind, though, to like the variability as to why students might not submit other than having a low score. Is that true?
Well, I can speak to Johns Hopkins. So here, if you want some real data, and Johns Hopkins is a very selective school, or in the college admissions world, we call it a highly rejective school. They had half of their applicants in 2020 applied without test scores. Half of those admitted students came from the non-submitter group. They accepted half without scores. Colgate, the same thing. So it really depends on the school. Some schools are really, really test optional, which means that they do a holistic review. And some schools say they're test optional, but they prefer looking at scores, right? Like a school like Case Western Reserve, they love scores. They love scores. And to them, they're a very data-driven school. And that's the word on the street. If you're applying to a school like Case, you need to submit scores. So it really depends on the institution. I would say another school that is pretty authentically test optional is Tufts. They sort of have the same statistics as Johns Hopkins. So it varies school by school. A lot of schools, as you can imagine, don't really divulge all this data, right? Because maybe they don't want to. But the schools that we have information on, we can see that half of the kids who do apply test optional are getting in test optional. My son is an example. He applied to all his schools test optional. He's a great student. He did terribly on his ACTs. And that 3-hour test, I just didn't feel was a reflective of his potential. And he got into every single school he applied to with distinguishment. So I would say that scores are important, but you don't need them to set yourself apart in the admission process.
Sounds like you navigated him well.
Yeah, he did great.
Davida, before we transition to our next topic, because I do want to leave space for what's coming for our listeners, ultimately, as someone in your position who shepherds students through the process, do you still recommend that a student take a standardized test? If so, which one and what are the differences?
Okay, so I definitely recommend they give it a shot. Right? I definitely recommend that then you don't have the should've, could've, would've, right? We never want in the college admission process for there to be a doubt. Oh, I wish I would have at least tried to take that test. Maybe that would have made the difference. Take the test, try it out. Try out both the ACT and the SATs. You don't even need to try them out in a real life situation. You can go online and you can sit for a test and then you can then self-score yourself and you can see which test you've done better on. So the ACT versus the SAT is a long-standing difference. ACT is notoriously known if you are a fast test taker, which means that you can work well under pressure. That is the test for you, right? It's a time test. And it moves very, very quickly. And also as a test that doesn't necessarily test so much your analytical skills, but it tests whether or not you can read for comprehension, if that makes sense.
Through aptitude test, correct?
It's an aptitude test, yeah.
An aptitude test like the LSAT.
Correct. And also the ACT has a whole science section, which the SAT doesn't have. So if you're not loving science, probably that might be a sign for you to switch over to the SAT.
But is the science section really a reading section?
It's an interpreting more of data and graphs and information like that. And if that's not your strong point, so some kids struggle with that also in a time situation. You might need that more time. I can move on to the SAT, but with the caveat that this whole SAT is switching over to a digital format.
That's perfect.
Yeah, right. Switching over to a digital format for our children, our students who are now current ninth graders. So if you have a child who is a current ninth grader, by the time they are taking tests in their junior and senior year, they are no longer going to have a paper to pen edition. They are going to be completely digital. The test will not be done at home. It will be done at a testing center. The College Board is really pushing for it to be done in schools, not at testing centers, and also during the day, so that schools can administer these tests during the school day. The College Board thinks that this is a great movement and that it will eliminate a lot of things that were difficult with the paper to pen issue, like shipping, like finding proctors, things like that. Many people in the test optional world who really favor test optional just say this is a repackaging of a tool that is a 2 to 3 hour test that is really not predictive of how a student is going to behave or learn in 4 years. So it's again, and with everything, there are debates and there are positives and there are negatives. Some students don't really work so well without paper to pen. Some schools might not have access to enough internet to have these tests really support what they need to do in their schools. So it's going to be an interesting shift. And I think that your guess is as good as mine. Nobody really knows how it's going to take off. The first U.S. debut of this will be in the PSATs in October of 2023. And then in 2024, the SAT is going completely digital.
So basically, my kids who are a little older, my last one is a sophomore, rising junior, won't be impacted. But Kristina, yeah, this is your future.
It's really interesting to see the impact of COVID on college admissions and visits and the testing. And I think as we continue on, the changes are only going to continue. I'm wondering, for students who elect not to take standardized tests for whatever reason, right? No judgment, or who don't submit their scores, how do those students really stand out from the crowd of thousands and thousands of applicants to have their application pop?
Right. So I like to think of the college admission process or the application as a stool, and you have different legs that support the seat of the stool. So you have one leg is the rigor of curriculum that your child has taken advantage of. Right? The school that they're applying to gets a school profile, which says how many APs are offered, how many IBs are offered, what kind of scores those students have, whatever it is, there's a school profile. In the context of the school that your child attends, is he or she, are they taking advantage of the rigor, right? Is there
question? I just want to interrupt because I think this is important. You touched on it. Do colleges care? Because I've heard many lectures on this, APVIB.
So I will say some colleges prefer AP.
That's what I heard.
I will say there are some, I have had a lot of surprises with students who are very similar profile, but if they're an IB student versus an AP student, my AP students somehow always seem to have the advantage. That's my little sample. I don't want to say that that's gospel, but that's sort of the trend that I noticed.
And you know what? That's consistent with the school that my daughter attends, that they chose to stay AP and they rejected IB because they noticed that you're a leg down from the AP kid. So.
Right. And I think also the curriculum for the IB is way more demanding and hard for schools to support. Right. And that's just also another piece to it. So I would say that's one leg of the stool, that rigor curriculum. Another leg of the stool is your extracurricular activities. What are the meaningful things that you're doing outside of the classroom? And when I say meaningful, that's
aside from just sport.
Right. Well, sports is a huge thing. I had a girl who was an equestrian, and she literally had 2 activities because there was no room in her day for another activity. If you're riding and you're, working in the stables, that's about all you have. When I say a meaningful activity, I'm saying that you don't belong to a club and you go once or twice, right? Meaningful is that you are either assuming a leadership position, you're seeing growth, whatever it looks like for each student. And I'm not going to argue, I'm not going to sit here and say that everybody has to be a president of a club. And I think that's completely wrong, because if we had a class filled with just presidents, it would be a terrible class because
That would get along
Well, I want to make a caveat, and I want to see if you would agree with this. That when I went to a lecture once at a college on the admissions process, and basically what they said is, look, we have to fill our orchestra. We have to fill our athletic teams. We have to fill our theater department. So let's say you have a student who is, I'm going to use equestrian, but they don't have an equestrian team. They might be more interested in that tuba player because they need a tuba player. Do you agree with that or disagree?
totally agree with that. And I would imagine that that equestrian probably is not going to apply to a school that doesn't have some sort of riding club or team. That's what I'm going.
But that's something that I feel very grateful in terms of the college planning process, is that if you have a student who may want a broader college that does not have an equestrian, then you say to that student in high school, that's great, you want to do this, but you have to think about, if you want to get into a different college, what those colleges are looking for.
Correct. And I also think for those students who have that one interest, you can find things within your school day to do that sort of extends beyond the stables. So I do think that colleges are looking for diversity, not only in ethnicity and race, they're also looking at diversity of interest as well. They want to see this sort of well-rounded student. I also stress to my clients, you need to do what you love. You should not do something just because you think it's going to get you into college. You have to still live your most authentic self. And I think that is really an important lesson for our youth. I mean, live your authentic self, but challenge yourself at the same time by joining new things. And that there's such a balance. Strike that balance, but do it for the right reasons.
I'm going to give you one last question, and we'll have to schedule you back because we are not done with you.
You are Davida. Knowledge, Davida.
Do standardized test scores, look, college is really expensive. Does it have any impact on scholarships?
It used to be used as a metric to decide for merit pre-pandemic. They used to look at those SAT scores and those ACT scores and say, okay, I'm going to give this kid money. That has all shifted since the pandemic. And if schools are not, some schools might be using still the ACTs and SATs, but most schools have migrated away from that in terms of their metrics.
Oh my gosh.
Well, Davida, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really wonderful chatting with you. And again, such invaluable information for our listeners. So we'll have to do this again.
All right. The pleasure is all mine, ladies.
Thanks for listening to Real Talk with Susan and Kristina. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. And leave us a review so other people can find the content we share here. You can follow us on Instagram. Just search our handle @StoneSupler. And for more resources, visit us online at studentdefense.kjk.com. Thank you so much for being a part of our Real Talk community. We'll see you next time.